The shot was impossible. 1,400 meters through a dust storm, a moving target, crosswind gusting to 30 knots. No spotter, no time, no margin for error. And the woman who took it was supposed to be a logistics clerk. Senior Chief Petty Officer Garrett Holt watched the enemy sniper crumple through his scope, then slowly turned to stare at the figure lying prone on the ridgeline above the village. Her rifle was still smoking. In 18 years as a Navy SEAL, Garrett Holt thought he had seen everything combat could offer. He was wrong. 72 hours earlier, forward operating base Sentinel sat quiet under the Syrian sunrise. Before we get into this story, drop a comment and let us know what state or country you're watching from. Maybe you have known someone whose true abilities were hidden from the world around them. Cassandra Vance walked the perimeter of a logistics compound with a clipboard pressed against her chest, her boots crunching against gravel still cool from the night. To anyone watching, she was exactly what her credentials claimed: a logistics coordination specialist, a desk worker attached to special operations support. Invisible. She preferred it that way. The supply manifests in her hand contained routine information: ammunition counts, meal ready-to-eat deliveries, fuel consumption reports. But her eyes tracked something else entirely: the way the SEAL operators moved between buildings, the tension in their shoulders, the increased communication traffic she had monitored since 0300. Something was happening, something they had not told her about. A boy appeared at the fence line, thin and dark-eyed, maybe 9 years old. He worked odd jobs around the base, carrying water and running messages for coins the Americans gave him. This morning his eyes had the hollow look of hunger. Casey glanced around. Regulations prohibited fraternization with locals, prohibited sharing rations, prohibited exactly what she was about to do. She pulled the protein bar from her cargo pocket, the one she had saved from breakfast, and slipped it through the fence gap. The boy's fingers closed around it instantly. "Be safe today," she said in broken Arabic. "Go home early." The boy nodded once and disappeared into the morning shadows. Casey watched him go, then turned back toward the compound. 3 SEAL operators stood near the Tactical Operations Center, watching her. The one in the middle, Senior Chief Holt, had arms crossed over his chest and an expression that could curdle milk. She knew that look. She had been receiving it for 6 weeks. Casey continued walking, angling toward the operations center. She had legitimate business there, supply requisition forms that required a signature. But as she approached, Holt stepped into her path. "Building is restricted right now," he said. "Mission planning in progress." "I have paperwork that needs authorization," Casey replied. "Commander Osei requested these forms by 0800. Then Commander Osei can come get them himself." Holt did not move. "This area is for operators only." Behind him, a younger SEAL with kind eyes looked uncomfortable. Petty Officer Castellan, they called him Rook. He was the only one who occasionally acknowledged her existence with something other than contempt. "Senior Chief," Rook said quietly, "she is just doing her job." Holt silenced him with a look. "Everyone has a job here, Castellan. Hers does not include being in spaces where she does not belong." Casey held Holt's stare for 3 seconds, long enough to make a point, not long enough to create an incident. Then she stepped back. "I will leave the forms with the duty officer," she said. Her voice betrayed nothing. She walked away with her spine straight, feeling their eyes on her back. She had faced worse than Garrett Holt, had operated in places where a wrong word meant death, had earned honors that would never appear on any record. But here, she was nobody, a clerk with a clipboard, furniture with a pulse. She returned to her workspace, a corner desk in a logistics building, and began processing the meaningless paperwork that justified her presence. Around her, the base hummed with activity she was not supposed to notice. But she noticed everything. The increased helicopter traffic over the past 3 days. The arrival of a signals intelligence team she had not been briefed about. The late-night meetings in the Tactical Operations Center that excluded everyone below commander rank. They were planning something significant. An operation that required this level of security typically meant a high-value target extraction, which meant heightened danger, which meant the SEALs walking around this base with their superior attitudes might not all come back. Casey pulled up her supply tracking database and began cross-referencing ammunition requests. The numbers told a story the briefings never would. At 1800 hours, her secure device vibrated against her thigh. A message through channels that officially did not exist, on equipment a logistics specialist should never possess. She read the contents once, then deleted them. Her blood ran cold. The operation was compromised. Enemy forces had received intelligence about the mission timeline and location. The SEAL team walking into that village tomorrow was walking into a trap, and she could not warn them without destroying everything she had built. Casey spent the night calculating options that did not exist. Every scenario ended the same way. If she revealed her source, she exposed an intelligence network that had taken years to build. Assets would die. Operations across 3 countries would collapse. But if she stayed silent, the men sleeping in those barracks might not survive tomorrow. She stood at her window, watching the darkness beyond the wire. Somewhere out there, enemy fighters were preparing positions in a village that was supposed to be empty, rehearsing the ambush that would tear through the SEAL team like paper. Her fingers found the photograph in her pocket, worn soft at the edges from years of handling. Mia smiled up at her from the picture, gap-toothed and 7 years old. She was 12 now. Casey had missed the lost teeth, the new ones growing in, the transition from little girl to something closer to young woman. "I will be home soon," she whispered to the photograph. The same lie she had told 100 times. She tucked the picture away and made her decision. There had to be a way to deliver the warning without exposing the source. Something indirect, something deniable. By 0600, Casey had a plan. She found Lieutenant Commander Osei in the chow hall, eating breakfast alone while reviewing documents on a tablet. Derek Osei carried himself with the quiet confidence of a man who had earned his position through competence rather than politics. West Point graduate who chose Navy over Army. Nigerian immigrant parents who had sacrificed everything for his opportunities. He was fair-minded and thorough, which made him dangerous to approach. "Commander," Casey said, stopping at a respectful distance. "Do you have a moment?" Osei looked up, took a second to place her face. "The logistics specialist. Vance, right?" "Yes, sir. I wanted to flag a supply chain concern." She sat when he gestured to the chair across from him. For the next 5 minutes, she walked him through a fabricated concern about fuel delivery routes, insurgent activity along the northern corridor, pattern analysis suggesting increased enemy surveillance of American supply movements. What she was really saying, buried beneath the logistics jargon, was that the enemy had eyes on their operations. That information was leaking, that tomorrow's mission might not be as secret as they believed. Osei listened politely. When she finished, he nodded once. "I appreciate you bringing this to my attention," he said. "I will make sure the logistics security team reviews your concerns." The dismissal was gentle but absolute. She was a clerk offering tactical analysis to a special operations commander. The information had nowhere to land. "Sir," Casey pressed carefully, "if I could just suggest that operational security might benefit from Vance." Osei held up a hand. "I understand you're trying to help, but mission planning is not within your purview. Focus on your supply chains. Let's focus on operations." She held his gaze for 1 second longer than appropriate, searching for any crack in his certainty. Finding none. "Yes, sir," she said, and left him to his breakfast. The morning sun was climbing when she reached the qualification range. Once per month, all personnel attached to forward operating bases were required to demonstrate basic weapons proficiency. For Casey, this meant performing badly enough to confirm every assumption about her capabilities. She drew her standard-issue sidearm and faced the targets. 25 meters. Stationary silhouettes. A distance she could shoot blindfolded. The range safety officer gave the command, and Casey began firing. She grouped her shots in a pattern that looked almost competent. Close enough to the center to pass qualification. Far enough to suggest she was straining at the edge of her abilities. When she finished, her score placed her in the bottom third of base personnel. "Not bad for a desk jockey," the range officer said without malice. Casey thanked him and holstered her weapon. As she turned to leave, she noticed Master Sergeant Elijah Trask watching from the observation area. Army Special Forces. Green Beret on temporary assignment coordinating joint operations. The one person on this base who knew exactly what she was. Their eyes met. Trask glanced at her target, then back at her face. The corner of his mouth twitched in what might have been amusement. He knew she had just shot a deliberately mediocre score. Knew her real qualification numbers would embarrass half the operators on this base. But he said nothing, just walked away with his hands in his pockets. Casey returned to the logistics building and tried to focus on her cover work. The hours crawled past. Every minute brought the mission closer. Every minute was another chance lost. At 1600, Rook appeared in her doorway. He looked uncertain, glancing behind him before stepping inside. "Hey," he said. "Mind if I sit?" Casey gestured to the empty chair. He dropped into it with the graceless exhaustion of someone carrying too much weight. They sat in silence for a moment. Then Rook spoke. "My sister's Army," he said, "stationed in Germany. She is a mechanic, works on helicopters." Casey waited. "Some of the guys give me grief because I worry about her. Say she is safe in Germany. Nothing is going to happen. But I know it can go wrong even in safe places." He met Casey's eyes. "I do not think the senior chief means anything personal against you. He just has his reasons." "Everyone has reasons," Casey said. "He lost his sister." Rook's voice dropped lower. "She was Army too. Convoy got hit in Afghanistan. He was stateside when it happened. Could not do anything." She paused. "I think he believes if he keeps women away from a sharp end, he is protecting them somehow." Casey absorbed this information. It did not excuse Holt's behavior, but it explained the shape of his hostility. "Your operation tomorrow," she said carefully. "Stay sharp out there." Rook's eyes narrowed slightly. "What do you mean?" "I just mean the area has been active lately. Supply convoys have reported increased surveillance." She held his gaze. "Trust your training. Watch your corners. Come back safe." Something flickered in Rook's expression. Uncertainty. The beginning of a question he did not know how to ask. Before he could speak, a shadow fell across the doorway. Holt stood there, arms crossed, jaw tight. "Castellan. Briefing in 5. Rook stood immediately. "On my way, Senior Chief." He left without looking back. Holt remained in the doorway for a long moment, staring at Casey with an expression she could not read. Then he turned and walked away. That night, Casey watched from the shadows as the SEAL team loaded into vehicles. Weapons checked, gear secured, faces painted for the darkness ahead. They were driving toward a trap, and she had failed to stop them, unless she stopped being invisible. Casey found Trask behind the motor pool field stripping a rifle that was not standard issue. He did not look up when she approached, but his hands paused for half a second. "Acknowledgement. I need your help," Casey said. Trask set down the rifle bolt and wiped his hands on a rag. His eyes scanned the area behind her, checking for observers. Satisfied they were alone, he leaned against the vehicle bay wall. "That is a sentence I never expected to hear from you, Vance. The mission tomorrow is compromised." Casey kept her voice low and even. "Enemy forces have intelligence on the timeline and target location. The SEAL team is walking into a prepared ambush." Trask's expression did not change, but something shifted behind his eyes. "How solid is your source?" "Solid enough that I would stake my life on it." She paused. "I already am." He studied her for a long moment. They had worked together 18 months ago in a place that did not officially exist, running an operation that would never appear in any record. He had seen what she could do, had watched her make shots that defied physics and keep her nerve when everything around them was falling apart. "Why come to me?" he asked. "Why not go through your own channels?" "Because my channels would burn the source to protect the network. They would let those men die to preserve long-term intelligence capabilities." Casey's jaw tightened. "I am not willing to make that trade." Trask picked up the rifle bolt and resumed his work. His hands moved with the automatic precision of a man who had performed this task 10,000 times. "What do you want me to do?" he said. "Raise concerns through your chain. Joint operations coordination gives you standing to question mission security. If the concerns come from special forces instead of a logistics clerk, Osei might actually listen. And if he does not listen..." Casey had already considered this possibility, had already made her decision. Then I stopped the ambush myself. Trask's hands went still. He looked at her with an expression that mixed respect with something close to concern. You know what that would cost you. I know what it would cost those men if I do nothing. He was quiet for a long time. When he spoke again, his voice was softer. I will talk to Osei. Suggest that recent intelligence patterns warrant additional precautions. Maybe convince him to position the quick reaction force closer to the objective. He met her eyes. But Casey, if this goes wrong, I cannot protect you. I am not asking you to protect me, she said. I am asking you to help me protect them. Trask nodded once. Then he returned his attention to the rifle, and Casey understood the conversation was over. She walked back toward the logistics compound, her mind already moving to contingencies. Trask would do what he could. Maybe it would be enough, but probably it would not. The supply shed stood at the far edge of the compound, away from the main traffic patterns. Casey had chosen this location deliberately when she first arrived at FOB Sentinel. Easy to access, easy to overlook. The perfect place to store equipment that did not belong to a logistics specialist. She unlocked the door and slipped inside. The crates lining the walls contained exactly what their manifest claimed. Spare parts, communications equipment, emergency rations. But behind the third row, hidden beneath a false bottom, lay the tools of her actual trade. Casey removed the foam padding and looked at what lay beneath. A precision rifle broken down into its component parts. Match-grade ammunition in sealed containers. A rangefinder and ballistic calculator. A ghillie modification kit she had assembled herself. She had not touched this equipment in 6 weeks. Had hoped she would not need to. Her hands moved without conscious thought, assembling the rifle with the muscle memory of 1,000 repetitions. Stock locked to receiver. Barrel seated and torqued. Scope mounted and verified. Each movement precise and economical. When she finished, she held a weapon that could reach out and touch targets at distances most shooters could not imagine. A rifle that had ended 127 lives across 4 continents. She checked the scope 0 against reference marks she had established during her first week on base. Confirmed the ammunition was stored properly and undamaged. Loaded 3 magazines with the care of someone who understood that each round might be the difference between life and death. Then she broke the rifle down again and packed it into a case that looked like standard communications equipment. At 2200, she signed out a vehicle under the pretense of checking a supply cache at a forward position. The duty officer barely glanced at her paperwork. Logistics runs happened at all hours. Nobody questioned a clerk doing clerk work. Casey drove north through the darkness, navigating by GPS toward the village where tomorrow's operation would unfold. She had studied the terrain maps until she could see the landscape with her eyes closed. Knew every ridge line and depression. Every potential firing position and escape route. 12 kilometers from base, she pulled off the road and killed the engine. The village lay in the valley below, dark and seemingly empty. But thermal imaging would tell a different story. She would not use thermal imaging tonight. Could not risk any electronic signature that might alert the enemy to her presence. Instead, she relied on older skills. Patience, observation, the ability to read terrain the way other people read words. For 3 hours, she watched the village through her rifle scope, noted the buildings with blocked windows, the rooftops with fresh disturbance patterns, the movement shadows that appeared and disappeared too regularly to be random. Her intelligence was correct. The enemy was already in position. At least 15 fighters, possibly more, distributed across the village in a classic L-shaped ambush formation. The SEAL team would enter the kill zone before they knew it existed. Casey marked positions on her mental map, calculated distances and angles, identified the high ground where she could establish overwatch without being detected. Then she drove back to base, filed her supply run documentation, and tried to sleep. In 6 hours, the SEALs would walk into a trap, and she would be watching from above, ready to do what she had sworn she would never do again. The convoy rolled out at 0530, 3 vehicles carrying 8 operators into the gray pre-dawn light. Casey watched from behind the logistics building as the SEALs loaded their gear with the quiet efficiency of men who had done this 100 times before. Holt was last to board, pausing at the vehicle door to scan the compound. For a moment, his gaze passed over the spot where Casey stood in the shadows. Then he climbed in, and the convoy disappeared through the gate. 20 minutes later, Casey signed out her own vehicle. Different route, different destination on paper. Same objective. She drove fast through the empty roads, pushing the vehicle harder than regulations allowed. The sun was climbing now, painting the desert in shades of gold and rust. Beautiful country for an ugly purpose. The ridge she had identified during her reconnaissance lay 3 kilometers east of the village. High ground with clear sight lines into the valley below. She had calculated the distances the night before. 800 meters to the village entrance. 1,100 to the central square, 1,400 to the far edge where the enemy sniper would likely position. Casey parked the vehicle in a wadi where it would be invisible from the road. Then she humped her gear up the ridge, moving with the practiced patience of someone who understood that speed meant nothing if you were dead. By 0700, she was in position. Rifle assembled, scope calibrated for temperature and humidity. 3 magazines laid out within easy reach. Through her scope, she watched the village come alive with false normalcy. A few civilians moving through the streets, probably locals paid to maintain the illusion of routine. Behind the blocked windows, she knew, fighters were checking weapons and rehearsing their ambush. The wait was the hardest part. It always had been. At 0815, the SEAL convoy appeared on the road below. 3 vehicles moving in tactical formation, maintaining proper spacing. They had no idea what waited for them. Casey tracked their approach through her scope, watched them dismount at the village perimeter and begin their infiltration. 8 operators spreading into 2 4-man teams, covering angles, clearing corners. Textbook execution. It would not matter. The first shots came from the western buildings. Automatic weapons fire raking across the SEAL positions. Then the eastern side opened up, catching the operators in the crossfire that Casey had predicted. She watched Holt die behind a low wall, already returning fire and shouting commands. Watched Rook take a round to the leg and go down hard, his teammate dragging him toward cover. Watched Commander Osei calling for support on his radio while rounds cracked past his head. The ambush was perfectly executed. 15 fighters minimum, maybe 20, dug in positions with overlapping fields of fire. The SEALs were outgunned and outflanked. Casey forced her breathing to slow. Panic was death in this work. She needed cold calculation. The machine gunner on the western rooftop was the priority target. He was pinning down the left flank, preventing any movement toward better cover. 800 meters. Moderate crosswind. An easy shot. She settled her crosshairs on center mass. Exhaled half a breath. Squeezed the trigger. The machine gunner dropped. His weapon went silent. On the ground, Holt reacted instantly. He did not know where the shot came from, but he knew an opportunity when he saw one. He directed 2 operators to push toward the western buildings while the enemy scrambled to fill the gap. Casey was already finding her next target. A fighter with a rocket-propelled grenade launcher was moving into position on a rooftop. If he got that shot off, the SEAL casualties would multiply. 900 meters. Slight uphill angle. She adjusted her hold and fired. The fighter collapsed before he could shoulder the weapon. Now, the enemy knew they were dealing with more than just the SEAL team. Fighters began looking up toward the ridgelines, trying to locate the new threat. Casey saw one pointing in her general direction, but her position was well concealed. They could guess, but they could not see her. She dropped 2 more fighters in rapid succession. Each shot calculated, precise, lethal. The rhythm of death she had learned in places that did not have names. Holt was rallying his team, using the chaos to consolidate positions and establish a perimeter. Rook was still down but conscious, applying a tourniquet to his own leg with hands that shook, but did not stop. Then Casey saw the counter-sniper. He appeared in the minaret on the village's eastern edge. A patient man who had been waiting for exactly this moment. While his comrades drew fire and died, he had been searching for the hidden shooter. Now he found her. The round cracked past Casey's head close enough that she felt the pressure wave against her cheek. She rolled left instinctively, abandoning her position as a second round tore into the dirt where her chest had been. He was good, trained, probably Syrian military with Russian instruction. The kind of shooter who did not miss twice. Casey scrambled to new cover behind a rock formation. Her heart was pounding now, the cold calculation cracking under the primal knowledge that someone was hunting her. Through the dust her movement had kicked up, she could see the minaret. The sniper was invisible behind the narrow window, but she knew he was there, watching, waiting. She had maybe 3 seconds before he acquired her new position. 3 seconds to solve an impossible equation. Distance to the minaret, 1,100 meters. Wind had shifted, now gusting from the northwest. His cover gave him advantage. She could see only a sliver of the window where he lurked. Casey steadied her rifle, found that tiny gap in the stone, calculated the angle that would send her round through the narrow opening, and fired. The shot struck his scope, shattering the optics and driving fragments into his face. Not a kill, but enough. He recoiled from the window, out of the fight. One threat neutralized. But through her scope, Casey saw something that turned her blood cold. Another sniper, one she had not detected during her reconnaissance. He was setting up on a collapsed wall at the village's southern edge, 1,400 meters from her position, and his rifle was aimed directly at Commander Osei, who had moved to help drag a wounded operator to cover. The dust storm was thickening now, wind gusting to 30 knots. The distance at the extreme edge of her rifle's effective range. It was an impossible shot, the kind of shot that existed only in training fantasies and war stories that nobody believed. Osei had maybe 3 seconds to live. Casey did the math in her head. Hold 6 feet left for wind, 4 feet high for distance. Lead the target by half a second. 15% chance of success. Maybe less. She took the shot anyway. The world collapsed to a single point. Crosshairs on a target barely visible through the swirling dust. Wind howling across the ridge like a living thing trying to push a round off course. 1,400 meters of uncertainty between her rifle and the man who was about to kill Commander Osei. Casey squeezed the trigger. The rifle kicked against her shoulder. The round left the barrel at 2,800 feet per second, immediately beginning its battle against gravity and wind. She watched through her scope as the bullet traced an invisible arc across the valley. Time stretched, a lifetime compressed into the 1.3 seconds of flight time. The enemy sniper jerked once and crumpled. Center mass. The impossible shot made possible through mathematics and muscle memory, and something that might have been luck or might have been the accumulated weight of every shot she had ever taken. On the ground, Osei continued dragging the wounded operator to cover, never knowing how close he had come to death. The sniper who had been about to kill him lay motionless on the collapsed wall, his rifle unfired. Casey allowed herself one breath of relief. Then she returned to work. The ambush was breaking apart. With their snipers eliminated and their key positions neutralized, the remaining fighters were losing cohesion. Some continued firing from cover. Others began withdrawing toward the village's northern edge. Casey tracked the retreating fighters through her scope, but held her fire. They were no longer an immediate threat to the SEAL team. Killing them now would be execution, not combat. She had drawn that line years ago. Some nights she wondered if it made any difference. Below, Holt was pressing the advantage. He led a 2-man element in a flanking movement that collapsed the enemy's western position. The remaining fighters who had not fled were surrendering or dying. Then she heard the helicopters. The quick reaction force appeared over the eastern ridge, 2 birds carrying reinforcements that would seal the village and sweep for remaining threats. Trask had done what he promised. He had positioned the QRF closer to the objective. They had arrived in 8 minutes instead of 15. It had almost not been enough, but almost only counted in horseshoes and hand grenades, as her old instructor used to say. Casey began breaking down her rifle. The immediate crisis was over. Now came the harder part. She had revealed herself. Not her face, not her identity, but her capabilities. Somewhere in that village, 8 Navy SEALs were asking themselves who had provided Overwatch, who had made shots that should not have been possible, who had saved their lives. The answers to those questions would unravel everything. She packed her gear with the same methodical precision she had used to assemble it. Rifle components in their foam cutouts. Spent brass collected and pocketed. Any sign of her presence erased from the ridge. By the time the QRF had secured the village, Casey was driving back toward base on a route that would place her nowhere near the operation. Her supply run documentation was time-stamped and logged. Her alibi was airtight. But alibis only mattered if no one looked too closely. She returned to FOB Sentinel at 0945, parked her vehicle in the motor pool, and walked to the logistics building as if nothing had happened. Her hands were steady. Her breathing was normal. The only evidence of the morning's events was a slight tremor in her left leg that she controlled through force of will. The base was buzzing with news of the ambush. Word traveled fast in small compounds. By the time Casey reached her desk, everyone knew that the SEAL team had walked into a trap and fought their way out with the help of an unknown shooter. Theories multiplied through the afternoon. Some said it was a CIA asset. Others claimed Special Forces had been running a parallel operation. A few suggested the shots had come from the SEALs themselves, one operator covering while the others fought. No one suggested the logistics clerk. At 1400, the convoy returned. Casey watched from her window as the vehicles rolled through the gate. Wounded were transferred to the medical station. Gear is unloaded and cleaned. Operators gathered in small groups, talking in low voices. She saw Rook carried on a stretcher, his leg bandaged but his eyes alert. He would survive. The wound was clean, the bone intact. A few months of recovery, and he would be back with his team. Holt stood apart from the others, arms crossed, staring at nothing. Casey recognized that look. He was replaying the engagement in his head, analyzing, questioning, looking for answers. At 1600, Master Sergeant Trask appeared in Casey's doorway. His face revealed nothing, but his presence said everything. Commander Osei wants to debrief all personnel, he said, including support staff. Casey nodded and followed him out. The Tactical Operations Center was crowded with operators and support personnel. Osei stood at the front, a map of the village displayed on the screen behind him. His expression was controlled, but his eyes carried the weight of a man who had almost lost people. We were compromised, he said without preamble. Enemy forces had advanced knowledge of our operation. We walked into a prepared ambush. He paused, letting that sink in. We also received unexpected support. An unknown shooter engaged enemy positions from an elevated location east of the village. He looked around the room. I want to know who that shooter was. Silence. Casey kept her expression neutral, just another face in the crowd. The shots came from beyond our perimeter, Osei continued. Precision fire at ranges exceeding 1,000 meters. Whoever made those shots is an expert marksman operating in our area without authorization. Holt spoke from the side of the room. Sir, I tracked the trajectory on 3 of those shots. The position was on the eastern ridge, approximately 3 clicks from the village. Osei nodded. We will send a team to examine the site tomorrow. In the meantime, I want everyone to report any unusual activity or personnel movement from the past 48 hours. His eyes swept the room again, paused for a fraction of a second on Casey, then moved on. Dismissed, he said. The crowd dispersed. Casey walked back toward the logistics building, feeling the weight of observation on her back. Trask fell in a step beside her. You cleaned the site, he said quietly. There is nothing to find. Osei is not stupid. He's going to keep digging. Casey said nothing. There was nothing to say. She had made her choice. Now she would live with the consequences. Behind them, Holt watched the logistics clerk walk away with the Special Forces Master Sergeant. Something about the pairing bothered him. Something about her stillness during the briefing. He did not know what he was seeing, but he was starting to look. Holt could not sleep. He lay on his rack staring at the ceiling, replaying the ambush frame by frame. The machine gunner dropping. The RPG fighter collapsing before he could fire. The sniper in the minaret recoiling from his scope. And the shot that saved Osei. The impossible shot. 1,400 meters through a dust storm. Moving target, gusting wind. In 18 years of special operations, Holt had known exactly 3 shooters capable of making that shot. 2 were dead. The third was running a training program at Dam Neck and had not left Virginia in 8 months. So who was on that ridge? He sat up and pulled on his boots. Sleep was not coming. Answers might. The operations center was quiet at 0300. Holt logged into a terminal and began reviewing personnel files. Everyone assigned to FOB Sentinel. Support staff, logistics, communications, medical. Anyone who could have been off base during the window of the ambush. Most files were routine. Cooks and mechanics and administrators with backgrounds exactly as boring as they appeared. He was about to give up when he reached the V section. Vance Cassandra, Logistics Coordination Specialist. Her file was thin. Too thin. Education, basic training records, a string of unremarkable postings. No deployments to combat zones. No special qualifications. No reason for her to be at a forward operating base in Syria. Holt stared at the photograph attached to the file. The logistics clerk who had been haunting the edges of his awareness for 6 weeks. The woman he had dismissed as a tourist. A desk jockey. Furniture with a pulse. Something was wrong with this picture. He pulled up vehicle logs from the previous day. Cross-referenced them with her duty schedule. Found an entry that made his jaw tighten. Vance had signed out a vehicle at 0550. Supply run to a forward cache. She had returned at 0945. The ambush occurred at 0815. The ridge where the shooter had positioned was 12 kilometers from base, directly between the FOB and her documented destination. Coincidence. It had to be coincidence. But Holt had not survived 18 years by believing in coincidences. He saved the information and logged out. Then he walked through the pre-dawn darkness toward the logistics building. Casey sensed him before she saw him. A shift in the air pressure, a displacement of shadows in her peripheral vision. She was sitting at her desk reviewing manifests that did not matter, waiting for the other shoe to drop. Holt appeared in her doorway. He did not speak immediately, just stood there, studying her with the focus of a man trying to solve a puzzle that refused to make sense. "You were off base yesterday morning," he said finally. "Supply run." Casey did not look up from her paperwork. "It is in the log." "I saw the log." He stepped inside, closing the distance between them. 12 kilometers north, past the eastern ridge. "Is there a question in there, Senior Chief?" Holt moved closer. He was trying to intimidate her, crowding her space, using his size and rank to create pressure. It was a technique that worked on most people. Casey was not most people. She set down her pen and met his eyes, held them without blinking. Let the silence stretch until it became uncomfortable. Holt broke first. "Someone made shots yesterday that should not be possible," he said. "Someone saved my team. Saved Commander Osei. I want to know who. And you think it was me?" Casey allowed a small smile to touch her lips. "The logistics clerk who barely qualified on her sidearm last week. I think something about you does not add up." She leaned back in her chair. "A lot of things do not add up, Senior Chief. That is why they invented accountants." His jaw tightened. "This is not a joke." "No." Casey's voice went flat. "It is not. Your team walked into an ambush that someone set up with advanced intelligence. You have wounded in medical and a compromised operation that raises serious counterintelligence concerns. Those are the questions you should be asking. Not why a logistics clerk went on a supply run." The words hit him like cold water. She watched him process the implications. The ambush had not been bad luck. Someone had fed information to the enemy. Someone with access to mission planning. "How do you know the intelligence was compromised?" he asked slowly. Casey cursed internally. She had pushed too hard, revealed too much. Before she could respond, footsteps echoed in the hallway. Commander Osei appeared in the doorway, Trask a step behind him. "Senior Chief." Osei's voice carried command authority. "My office. Now." Holt held Casey's gaze for one more second. Then he turned and followed the commander out. Trask lingered for a moment, his expression unreadable. When they were gone, Casey allowed herself to breathe. She had bought time, but Holt was not going to stop digging, and she had just given him a new direction to dig. An hour later, she was summoned to the operations center. Osei sat behind his desk, Trask standing to one side. Holt was notably absent. "Close the door," Osei said. Casey complied. Then she stood at parade rest, waiting. Osei studied her for a long moment. "Master Sergeant Trask has vouched for you," he said finally. "He tells me you have capabilities that are not reflected in your official file." Casey said nothing. "He also tells me that you tried to warn us about the ambush, that you identified the threat and attempted to communicate it through appropriate channels." Still nothing. Osei leaned forward. "I'm going to ask you a direct question, and I need a direct answer. Were you on that ridge yesterday?" The silence stretched. Casey calculated options. Lies would unravel eventually. Truth would intermission. There was no good choice. So she made the only choice that mattered. "Yes," she said. Osei exhaled slowly. "Who are you really?" Trask stepped forward. "That is Chief Warrant Officer for Cassandra Vance," he said. "Former Marine Scout sniper. Currently attached to a unit I am not cleared to name." His eyes met Casey's. "And she just saved every one of your men." The revelation hung in the air like smoke after an explosion. Osei stared at her. The logistics clerk. The invisible woman. The furniture with a pulse. 127 confirmed kills, Trask continued quietly. For combat deployments under her previous service. Classified operations on 3 continents under her current assignment. She is one of the most lethal precision shooters the United States has ever produced. Casey stood motionless, feeling her carefully constructed cover crumble around her. "And she has been living in your logistics compound for 6 weeks. Trask finished, because her actual mission requires her to be invisible. Osei was quiet for a long time. When he spoke, his voice was careful. "What is your actual mission?" Casey met his eyes. "Finding the person who compromised your operation," she said. "And I'm close." The medical station smelled of antiseptic and exhaustion. Casey stood in the doorway, watching Rook adjust himself on the narrow cot, his bandaged leg elevated on a stack of pillows. He looked pale but alert, his eyes tracking her approach with curiosity rather than suspicion. She had not planned to come here, had told herself it was unnecessary, a risk to operational security. But something had pulled her through the compound in the gray hours before dawn. "You are the shooter," Rook said. It was not a question. Casey pulled a metal chair close to his bedside and sat down. "Word travels fast. Senior Chief came by an hour ago. He looked like someone had hit him in the head with a brick." Rook almost smiled. "Told me the logistics clerk turned out to be some kind of ghost. Said you made a shot that should not exist." "I got lucky." Rook shook his head. "I have been around shooters my whole career. Luck does not make 1,400-meter kills through a dust storm." He studied her face. "You knew we were walking into a trap. That is why you told me to stay sharp." Casey did not deny it. "Why not just tell us?" he asked. "Why let us walk in there?" "Because telling you would have burned sources that took years to develop." Casey's voice was flat, but something flickered beneath the surface. "Assets would have died. Operations across 3 countries would have collapsed." She paused. "I tried to find another way. Tried to warn you through channels. No one listened." Rook was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "But you came anyway, even though you were not supposed to." Casey looked at her hands. "I was not going to let you die because nobody would listen to a logistics clerk." The silence between them was different now. Not awkward, but weighted with understanding. "How bad is the leg?" Casey asked. "Clean through the meat. Missed the bone and the artery." Rook shrugged with the casual acceptance of someone who had always known injury was part of the job. "Doc says I will be running again in 3 months. Back with the team in 6. "Good." Rook shifted on the cot, wincing slightly. "Can I ask you something?" Casey nodded. "What is it like?" He hesitated. "Being invisible. Having everyone look right through you." She considered the question. Most people would have offered platitudes. Told him it was necessary, that the mission justified the isolation. But Rook had been kind to her when no one else was. He deserved honesty. "Lonely," she said simply. "It is the loneliest thing I have ever done." Rook nodded slowly. "For what it is worth, I am glad you were there. Invisible or not." Casey stood. She had stayed too long already. The compound would be waking soon, and there were still questions that needed answers. "Get some rest," she said, "and stop trying to walk on that leg before the doctor clears you." Rook grinned. Yes, ma'am. Then his expression sobered. Hey, thank you for saving us. Casey paused at the doorway. Do not thank me yet, she said. I still have to find the person who sold you out. She left before he could respond. The operations center was already active when she arrived. Osei had called a restricted briefing for 0700, limited to essential personnel. Trask was there. Holt stood in the corner, his arms crossed, and his expression unreadable. Casey took a position along the wall and waited. Osei wasted no time with preamble. Chief Warrant Officer Vance has been running a counterintelligence operation from this base, he said. Her mission is to identify the source of an intelligence leak that has compromised multiple operations in this theater. He paused. Yesterday's ambush confirms that the leak is active and ongoing. Holt's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. I have been in contact with her chain of command, Osei continued. They have authorized her to read us in on relevant details. He looked at Casey. The floor is yours. Casey stepped forward. For the past 6 weeks, I have been monitoring communications patterns and access logs across FOB Sentinel. The intelligence that compromised your operation came from someone with access to SEAL team mission planning. Someone inside the wire. She let that sink in before continuing. I have narrowed the leak to 2 possible sources. Both are stationed at this base. Both had access to the specific details that were passed to enemy forces. Who? Holt asked. His voice was tight with controlled anger. A signals intelligence analyst named Brennan, and an interpreter with security clearance named Masood. The room went silent. Everyone knew both men. Brennan played poker with the communications team. Masood had been translating for American forces for 3 years. How do we determine which one? Osei asked. Casey had already considered this. We set a trap, she said. Feed different false information through each channel. Whichever version reaches the enemy identifies the traitor. Osei nodded slowly. How long do we have? Casey glanced at Trask before answering. There is another operation scheduled for 48 hours from now. A joint raid with local partner forces. If the traitor takes the bait, they will attempt to pass the information before that window closes. And if they do not take the bait, Trask added, we have a larger problem than one compromised asset. Osei absorbed this. He looked at Holt. Senior Chief, I need your team on standby. If we identify the leak, I want immediate detention capability. Holt nodded once. Understood. Then he looked at Casey. Something had shifted in his expression. Not forgiveness exactly, but something adjacent to it. Recognition, perhaps. Acknowledgement that he had been wrong. What do you need from us? He asked. Casey met his eyes. I need you to act normal. Let Brennan and Masood see business as usual. No changes in behavior, no unusual attention. If either of them suspects they're being watched, they will go dark and we lose our chance. Holt held her gaze for a long moment. Then he nodded again. You'll have it. The briefing ended. Personnel filtered out toward their duties. Casey remained behind, studying the map on the wall. 48 hours to identify a traitor. 48 hours before another team walked into potential danger. Trask appeared at her shoulder. You did good work yesterday, he said quietly. But you know this is not over. Casey traced the lines on the map with her eyes. It is never over. He left her alone with the weight of what came next. Somewhere on this base, a traitor was calculating their next move. And Casey was calculating hers. The trap was elegant in its simplicity. Casey crafted 2 versions of the false intelligence. The first, fed through channels Brennan would access, described a raid on a weapons cache 12 kilometers south of the base. The second, routed through Masood's translation duties, referenced a high-value target extraction 15 kilometers east. Neither operation existed. Both locations were empty desert monitored by reconnaissance drones. Whichever location showed enemy activity would identify the traitor. Casey set the bait at 0800 and began her watch. The next 36 hours passed in a blur of surveillance and waiting. She monitored communications logs from a terminal in the operations center, tracking every message that passed through the base's networks. Trask rotated shifts with her, spelling her for food and brief intervals of sleep that never quite came. Holt surprised her on the second morning. He appeared in the operations center with 2 cups of coffee, setting one on the desk beside her without comment. Then he pulled up a chair and sat down. "You should not be here," Casey said. "If Brennan or Masood see you with me, it could spook them. Brennan is in the Signals tent running diagnostics. Masood is with the partner force commanders reviewing translation protocols." Holt sipped his coffee. "I have 10 minutes before anyone notices I'm gone." Casey wrapped her hands around the warm cup. She had not realized how cold she was until the heat touched her fingers. "I owe you an apology," Holt said. Casey shook her head. "You do not owe me anything." "Yes, I do." He stared at the screens rather than her face. "I spent 6 weeks treating you like you did not belong here, like you were a liability, a threat to my team." He paused. "And you saved us anyway. You were protecting your people." Casey's voice was neutral. "I understand that." "No." Holt turned to look at her. "I was protecting myself from something that happened a long time ago, something that had nothing to do with you." Casey thought of what Rook had told her. The sister, the convoy, the grief that had calcified into prejudice. "Your sister," she said quietly. Holt flinched like she had struck him. Then he nodded slowly. "Rachel. She was Army. Transportation Corps. Ran convoys in Helmand Province." He stopped, gathered himself. An IED took out her vehicle. She survived the blast, but not the ambush that followed. He met Casey's eyes. "I was stateside, training new operators while my sister bled out in a ditch halfway around the world." Casey said nothing. Some wounds did not need words. They needed witness. "After that, I convinced myself that keeping women away from combat was about protecting them." Holt's voice was rough, but it was never about protection. It was about control. "If I could keep women out of the fight, I would never have to feel that helpless again." He set down his coffee cup and stood. "What you did on that ridge, the shots you made, the lives you saved." He shook his head. "I have never seen anything like it. And I almost missed it because I was too busy looking at what I expected to see instead of what was actually there." Casey looked up at him. The man who had dismissed her for 6 weeks, who had blocked her for briefings and mocked her presence on his base, who was now standing in front of her with something that looked like genuine respect. "Apology accepted," she said. Holt nodded once. Then he turned and walked out, leaving Casey alone with her surveillance screens and the weight of his confession. At 1400, the trap sprung. Casey was reviewing communication logs when the alert triggered. Drone reconnaissance over the southern location had detected movement. Vehicles approaching the empty coordinates. Armed personnel deploying in tactical formation. "Brennan." She pulled up the Signals analyst's activity log and began tracing his communications. There, a burst transmission 6 hours earlier, routed through a civilian frequency that should have been blocked. The encryption was sophisticated but not unbreakable. Casey cracked it in 11 minutes. The message contained the exact coordinates and timeline from the false intelligence she had fed through Brennan's channels. Details that only someone with his access could have obtained. Proof that the Signals analyst had been selling American lives to the enemy. She reached for her radio to alert Osei when the door to the operations center opened. Brennan stood in the doorway. He was a slight man, mid-30s, with the pale complexion of someone who spent too much time staring at screens. His eyes moved from Casey to the displays behind her, reading the evidence of his exposure in the data streams flickering across the monitors. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then Brennan pulled a sidearm from beneath his jacket. "Step away from the terminal," he said. His voice was steady, but his hand trembled slightly. The tell of a man who had never pointed a weapon at another human being. Casey raised her hand slowly. She had her own sidearm on her hip, but drawing would take longer than Brennan needed to pull his trigger. At this range, even a nervous shooter would not miss. "It is over," she said calmly. "Drones have the location. Osei knows about the burst transmission. Even if you kill me, you're not walking off this base." Brennan's jaw tightened. "You do not understand. They have my family, my wife and daughter in Germany. If I stopped cooperating, they would kill them." Casey processed this information. It did not excuse what he had done, but it explained it. "We can help them," she said. "Get them to safety, but only if you put the weapon down." Brennan shook his head. You cannot protect them. These people have assets everywhere. In every base, every embassy. If I talk, my family dies. Behind Brennan, a shadow moved in the corridor. Hold. Casey kept her eyes locked on Brennan, careful not to telegraph the approaching threat. She needed to keep him talking, keep his attention forward. Then help us find those assets, she said. Give us the network. We take them down, your family is safe. Brennan hesitated. The gun wavered. Holt struck from behind, one arm wrapping around Brennan's throat while the other seized his weapon hand. The struggle lasted less than 3 seconds. Then Brennan was on the ground, disarmed and restrained, gasping for air. Casey lowered her hands. Holt looked up at her, breathing hard. You knew I was there. I hoped you were. She picked up Brennan's fallen weapon and saved it. Nice timing. Holt hauled Brennan to his feet. The traitor's face had gone slack with defeat. It really is over, Casey said quietly. But it does not have to end with your family in danger. Help us, and we help them. Brennan closed his eyes. Then he nodded. The interrogation would come later. For now, the leak was plugged. But Casey knew this was only the beginning. The interrogation room was a converted storage closet, bare walls, and a single light that cast harsh shadows across Brennan's face. He sat handcuffed to a metal chair, his earlier defiance replaced by the hollow exhaustion of a man who had been running for too long. Casey stood against the wall, while Osei conducted the formal questioning. Trask monitored from the doorway. Holt had wanted to be present, but Casey had advised against it. Brennan needed to feel safe enough to talk, and the senior chief's intensity would shut him down. Start from the beginning, Osei said. Brennan swallowed hard. It was 18 months ago. I was stationed in Germany, running signals analysis for European Command. A woman approached my wife at the market, said she knew things about my family, about my daughter's school, her route home, her favorite playground. His voice cracked. She said they would hurt them if I did not cooperate. Gave me a phone, told me to wait for instructions. A week later, the first request came. Troop movement schedules. Nothing critical, or so I told myself. But it escalated, Casey said. Brennan nodded miserably. It always escalated. First it was logistics. Then it was patrol routes. Then it was mission timelines. By the time I realized what I was really giving them, it was too late to stop. Who was your handler? Osei asked. I never met them face to face. Everything went through dead drops and encrypted channels. Brennan looked up. But I have the phone, the one they gave me. It has every communication, every request, every piece of intelligence I passed. I kept it as insurance, in case I ever needed leverage. Casey pushed off the wall. Where is it? Hidden in my quarters, behind a ventilation panel above my rack. She looked at Osei, who nodded. She left the room without another word. The barracks were quiet at this hour. Most personnel were at duty stations or in the chow hall. Casey moved quickly through the corridors, her mind already racing ahead to what the phone might reveal. Brennan's quarters were standard issue. Single rack, metal locker, desk barely large enough for a laptop. The ventilation panel was where he said it would be. Casey removed the screws with her multi-tool and reached into the darkness behind the grate. Her fingers closed around a small plastic bag. Inside was a cheap prepaid phone, the kind sold at convenience stores across 3 continents. She powered it on. The message history was extensive. 18 months of communications, just as Brennan had claimed. Requests for intelligence, confirmations of delivery, occasional threats when Brennan tried to slow down or stop. But it was the final messages that made Casey's blood run cold. The handler was demanding information about a new target, an American intelligence operative embedded at FOB Sentinel. A woman working under logistics cover who had been asking too many questions. They knew about her. Casey pocketed the phone and moved toward the door. She needed to get this to Osei, needed to start tracing the handler's network before they realized Brennan had been compromised. She was 2 steps from the exit when the door opened. Masood stood in the doorway. The interpreter was a compact man in his 40s, his face weathered by decades of working alongside American forces. He had been cleared by Casey's investigation. The false intelligence fed through his channels had produced no enemy response. But the look in his eyes was wrong. You found the phone? Masood said quietly. Casey's hand moved toward her sidearm. Masood made no move to stop her. He simply stood there, blocking the exit, his expression unreadable. "You are not the leak," Casey said slowly. "But you knew about it." Masood nodded. "Brennan was careless. I noticed the patterns months ago. The way he accessed files he should not need. The timing of his communications. Why did you not report it?" "Because Brennan was useful." Masood's voice was flat. "He gave them what they wanted. Small things. Manageable things. It kept them satisfied while I gathered what I really needed." Casey's mind raced. "Who are you?" Masood smiled without warmth. "I am someone who has been playing this game much longer than you, Chief Warrant Officer. Someone who has been waiting for the right moment to burn the entire network to the ground." He reached into his jacket. Casey drew her weapon in a single fluid motion, the barrel leveled at his chest before his hand cleared the fabric. Slowly, Masood withdrew a folded document and held it out. "My credentials," he said, "from an agency that does not officially exist. I have been tracking this cell for 3 years. Brennan was my way in." Casey did not lower her weapon. She took the document with her free hand and unfolded it. The classification markings were authentic. The authorization codes matched patterns she recognized from her own chain of command. "Your agency," she said. "Something like that." Masood lowered his hand. "I apologize for the deception, but I could not risk exposure until I knew you were legitimate. Too many operations have been compromised by people who appeared trustworthy." Casey processed this new information. The investigation had just become significantly more complicated. "The phone," she said. "Does it lead back to the network you have been tracking?" "It leads to one node." Masood's expression hardened. "But I know where the others are. Names, locations, communication protocols. Everything we need to dismantle the entire operation." He stepped aside, clearing the doorway. "We should bring Commander Osei up to speed," he said. "And then we have work to do." Casey held his gaze for a long moment. Trust was a luxury in this world. Verification was survival. But sometimes you had to take the leap. She holstered her weapon and followed Masood out into the corridor. Behind them, the phone in her pocket held the key to unraveling an enemy network that had been bleeding American intelligence for years. And Casey was just getting started. The briefing room felt smaller with the weight of what they now knew. Casey stood the front, the captured phone connected to a secure terminal. Masood sat to her left, his cover as interpreter discarded like a snake shedding old skin. Osei occupied the head of the table, his expression grave. Trask and Holt flanked him, both processing the revelations of the past hour. "The network is larger than we anticipated," Casey said. She pulled up a diagram on the screen. Brennan was one of 7 assets operating across 3 theater commands. Each one was recruited the same way. Family threatened, cooperation demanded, escalating requests until they were too compromised to stop. 7 assets, Osei repeated. "How much damage are we talking about?" Masood answered. 12 compromised operations over 18 months. 31 casualties that could be directly attributed to leaked intelligence. He paused. "And those are only the ones we can confirm." The silence that followed was suffocating. Holt broke it first. "Who is running this network?" "We have a name," Casey said. She tapped the keyboard, and a photograph appeared. Arkady Volkov, former Russian military intelligence, now working as a private contractor for whoever pays the highest price. He operates out of Turkey, just across the Syrian border. Masood leaned forward. "Volkov does not just collect intelligence. He sells it to multiple buyers. ISIS remnants, Iranian proxies, Syrian government forces. Anyone who wants American blood on their hands." "Can we get to him?" Holt asked. "That is the question." Casey pulled up a map. Volkov operates from a compound in southern Turkey. Technically allied territory, which means we cannot conduct direct action without creating an international incident. So he just gets away with it. Holt's voice carried an edge of barely controlled fury. 31 dead Americans, and we do nothing. I did not say that. Casey met his eyes. Volkov is coming to us. She pulled up an intercepted communication from the phone. 3 days from now, Volkov is scheduled to meet with a new asset. someone he has been cultivating inside American forces. The meeting is set for a location just inside Syrian territory. Masood picked up the thread. We let that meeting happen. We position assets to observe and document. When Volkov crosses into Syria, he becomes a legitimate target. Osei studied the map. What is the risk profile? Significant, Casey admitted. Volkov is paranoid and well protected. If he suspects a trap, he will abort and disappear. We get one chance at this. And if we succeed, Trask asked, we cut the head off the snake. Casey's voice was flat. The network loses its coordinator. The remaining assets lose their handler. It buys us time to roll up the rest of the operation. Osei was quiet for a long moment. Then he looked at Casey. What do you need? A small team. For operators maximum. Observation and interdiction capability. She glanced at Holt. I would like Senior Chief Holt as tactical lead. Holt blinked. After everything that had passed between them, she was asking for him specifically. You know this terrain, Casey said. You know your team. And you owe Volkov for what happened to your men. Holt's jaw tightened. She was right. The ambush that had wounded Rook, that had nearly killed Osei, that had forced her to reveal herself. All of it traced back to the intelligence Brennan had provided. Intelligence that Volkov had weaponized. I am in, Holt said. Osei nodded slowly. I will authorize the operation. But I want contingencies in place. If this goes wrong, I need options for extraction and escalation. Understood. Casey began outlining the tactical approach. Insertion points, observation positions, fields of fire. The operation would require precision timing and flawless execution. For the next 2 hours, they planned. Every variable considered, every contingency mapped. By the time they finished, the sun was setting over FOB Sentinel, painting the desert in shades of orange and red. Holt found Casey outside the operations center, watching the sunset. You could have picked anyone for this mission, he said. Why me? Casey did not look at him. Because I need someone who will not hesitate when the moment comes. Someone who has personal stakes in seeing this through. She paused. And because you deserve the chance to finish what started in that village. Holt stood beside her in silence. The man who had dismissed her as furniture. Who had blocked her for briefings and questioned her presence. Who had apologized and meant it. I was wrong about you, he said finally. I know. Not just about your capabilities. Holt's voice was quiet. About who you are. What drives you. I thought you were hiding because you were weak. But you were hiding because the mission required it. Because you were willing to be invisible so the work could get done. Casey finally looked at him. That is the job. It should not be. Holt met her eyes. People like you should not have to disappear to be effective. The system should make room for you, not force you underground. Maybe someday it will. Casey turned back to the sunset. Until then, we work with what we have. They stood together as darkness crept across the compound. Two people who had started as adversaries, now bound by shared purpose and mutual respect. In 3 days, they would face Volkov. In 3 days, the network would burn. But tonight, there was only the sunset and the weight of what was coming. Rook appeared on crutches, hobbling toward them with determination that defied his injury. I heard about the operation, he said. I want in. You can barely walk, Holt replied. I can shoot. Rook looked at Casey. You know I can shoot. Casey studied the young operator. His leg was healing, but far from ready. Taking him would be a risk, but leaving him behind might be worse. Observation only, she said finally. You stay back, provide overwatch, and do not engage unless absolutely necessary. Rook's face split into a grin. Yes, ma'am. Holt shook his head, but said nothing. They all knew the risks. They all accepted them. 3 days. Then the reckoning would come. The insertion happened under cover of darkness. Casey moved through the Syrian desert with Holt on her left and 2 SEALs from his team on her right. Rook held position a kilometer back, his injured leg propped against a rock formation as he scanned the terrain through a high-powered scope. The meeting site was an abandoned farm complex, 3 crumbling buildings arranged around a central courtyard. Volkov had chosen the location for its isolation. No weaknesses, no interference, no escape routes he did not control. He had not counted on Casey. They established positions an hour before dawn. Casey took the high ground, a rocky outcropping that gave her sight lines into the courtyard and the approach road. Holt and his team spread across the perimeter, covering exits and preparing for contingencies. Then they waited. The sun rose slowly, burning away the night chill and replacing it with the dry heat that characterized this part of Syria. Casey controlled her breathing, kept her body still, and watched the empty road through her scope. At 0930, dust appeared on the horizon. 3 vehicles. Rook's voice crackled through the earpiece. SUVs, moving in convoy formation. Casey tracked their approach. The vehicles were armored, the windows tinted. Professional transportation for a professional criminal. Copy, Holt responded. All teams hold position. No movement until we have positive identification. The convoy pulled into the courtyard and stopped. Doors opened. Armed men emerged first, scanning the perimeter with practiced efficiency. Then a figure stepped out of the middle vehicle. Arkady Volkov was smaller than his photograph suggested, compact and precise, with silver hair cropped close to his skull and eyes that moved constantly, evaluating threats even in apparent safety. He wore civilian clothes that probably cost more than a junior officer's annual salary. Positive ID on Volkov, Casey said quietly. He has 6 guards, armed with automatic weapons. Body armor visible under jackets. Where's the asset he is meeting? Holt asked. Not here yet. Casey scanned the road. We wait. 20 minutes passed. Volkov grew visibly impatient, checking his watch and speaking sharply to his guards. Then a single vehicle appeared from the east. Casey tracked it through her scope. A military jeep, American markings. Her stomach tightened. We have contact, she said. 1 vehicle approaching. U.S. military. The jeep pulled into the courtyard. A single figure emerged. Casey recognized the face immediately. Colonel Marcus Webb, Deputy Commander of Regional Intelligence Operations. A man with access to every classified briefing in the theater. The traitor was not some desperate analyst or compromised interpreter. It was a senior officer with decades of service and unlimited access. Are you seeing this? Holt's voice was strained. I see it. Casey's mind raced through implications. Webb would have access to everything. Troop movements, operation timelines, asset identities. If he had been feeding Volkov for any length of time, the damage would be catastrophic. In the courtyard, Webb and Volkov shook hands. They spoke briefly, Webb handing over a folder that Volkov examined with evident satisfaction. The exchange of traitors, conducted in plain sight. We need to take them both, Casey said. Volkov and Webb. Alive if possible. That was not the plan, Holt replied. We were supposed to observe and document. Plans change. Casey kept her scope trained on the courtyard. Webb changes everything. We cannot let him walk away and destroy evidence. Silence on the comms. Then Holt spoke again. All teams, prepare to move on my signal. The guards had relaxed slightly, their attention focused outward toward the empty desert. They did not expect trouble. They did not know that 4 of the most dangerous people on the planet were watching from concealed positions less than 200 meters away. Casey, Holt said, can you take Volkov's guards without hitting the principals? She calculated angles and distances. 6 targets spread across the courtyard, some partially concealed by vehicles, others standing in the open. For clean shots, she said. The other 2 will be moving by then. Your team will need to handle them. Understood. On my mark. Casey settled into position. First target was the guard nearest to Webb, the one most likely to use the colonel as a shield. Second was the man by the lead vehicle with the clearest line of fire on Holt's approach. Third and fourth were the guards flanking Volkov. She would have perhaps 3 seconds before the surviving guards reacted. 3 seconds to change the equation. Mark, Holt said. Casey fired. The first guard dropped. She cycled the bolt and fired again. The second guard spun and fell. Third shot took the man on Volkov's right. Fourth shot dropped the guard on his left. 2 seconds. The remaining guards were moving, reaching for weapons, trying to process the impossible accuracy of the fire raining down on them. Holt's team emerged from concealment, closing the distance with brutal efficiency. The fifth guard raised his weapon toward Holt. Casey put a round through his shoulder before he could fire. The sixth guard tried to run. One of Holt's men brought him down with a tackle. In the courtyard, Volkov stood frozen. Webb had dropped to his knees, hands raised, his face ashen with the sudden understanding that his treachery had reached its end. Holt approached Volkov with his weapon raised. "Arkady Volkov," he said, "you are being detained for crimes against the United States." Volkov's expression flickered. Then slowly he smiled. "You have no authority here," he said. "I am a Russian citizen on Syrian soil. Your government will not risk the diplomatic incident." Holt smiled back. It was not a pleasant expression. "That is the thing about black operations," he said. "They do not create diplomatic incidents. Because officially, they never happened." He zip-tied Volkov's hands behind his back while another operator secured Webb. The colonel was crying now, blubbering about lawyers and rights and a misunderstanding. Casey climbed down from her position and entered the courtyard. She walked past Volkov without a glance and stopped in front of Webb. 31, she said quietly. "That is how many Americans died because of the intelligence you sold." She let the number hang in the air. "I hope the money was worth it." Webb had no answer. The extraction was clean. Helicopters arrived within minutes, loading prisoners and operators for the flight back to FOB Sentinel. Casey was last to board, pausing at the door for one final look at the abandoned farm. It was over. The network was broken. The head of the snake lay severed in the dust, but the weight of 31 ghosts still pressed against her chest. Some victories did not feel like winning. The debriefs lasted 3 days. Casey answered questions from intelligence officers, military lawyers, and representatives from agencies whose names she was not cleared to know. She recounted every detail of the operation, from the first intercepted communication to the final extraction. The same story told a dozen different ways to a dozen different audiences. When it was finally over, Commander Osei found her in the logistics building. She was packing the few personal items she had accumulated during her time at FOB Sentinel. The photograph of Mia, a worn paperback she had never finished. The team patched the seals had given her. "Orders came through," Osei said. "You are being extracted at 1400. Casey nodded. She had expected this. Her cover was blown, her mission complete. There was no reason to stay. "For what it is worth," Osei continued, "I put you in for a commendation." He paused. "It will probably disappear into a classified file somewhere, but the people who matter will know what you did." "Thank you, sir." Osei extended his hand. She shook it. "If you ever need anything," he said, "you know where to find us." Then he was gone, and Casey was alone with her thoughts. She finished packing and walked outside. The Syrian sun was high and merciless, baking the compound in waves of shimmering heat. In a few hours, she would be on a transport heading west. Another base, another cover, another mission. But first, there were goodbyes to say. She found Rook in the medical station, his leg elevated while he played cards with another wounded operator. His face lit up when he saw her. "You are leaving," he said. It was not a question. Casey pulled a chair close to his bedside. "Transport leaves at 1400. Rook set down his cards. "I figured." He was quiet for a moment. "Will I see you again?" "Probably not." Casey kept her voice gentle. "That is the nature of this work. Ships passing." Rook nodded slowly. Then he reached into his pocket and withdrew a small object. A challenge coin, the sealed trident embossed on one side. "Senior Chief told me to give you this," he said. "Said you earned it." Casey turned the coin over in her hands. A simple piece of metal, but weighted with meaning. Acceptance from men who had dismissed her. Recognition from warriors who understood what she had done. "Tell him thank you," she said. "Tell him yourself." Rook grinned and pointed toward the door. "He is waiting outside, too proud to come in and say goodbye properly." Casey pocketed the coin and stood. She rested her hand briefly on Rook's shoulder. "Heal fast," she said, "and stay sharp." "Yes, ma'am." She found Holt leaning against the medical station wall, arms crossed, watching the compound activity with studied casualness. He straightened when she approached. "Rook gave me the coin," Casey said. Holt shrugged. "You earned it." He fell in a step beside her as she walked toward the motor pool. "I meant what I said before. The system should make room for people like you. Force you to operate in shadows and pretend to be less than you are. Maybe someday it will, Casey replied. Until then, the shadows are where the work gets done. They walked in silence for a moment. Then Holt spoke again. What happens now? For you, I mean. Another assignment. Another cover. Casey watched a helicopter descend toward the landing pad. The work does not stop because one network went down. There are always more. Holt stopped walking. Casey turned to face him. If you ever need backup, he said. If you ever find yourself on a ridge somewhere, outnumbered and outgunned. He met her eyes. Call me. I will find a way to get there. Casey allowed herself a small smile. I will keep that in mind, Senior Chief. She extended her hand. Holt shook it, his grip firm and steady. It was an honor, he said, even if I was too stupid to realize it at first. The honor was mutual. Casey released his hand and stepped back. Take care of your team. Always. She turned and walked toward the waiting helicopter. Behind her, Holt watched until she disappeared inside. The flight to Ramstein took 7 hours. Casey slept for most of it, her body finally surrendering to the exhaustion she had been holding at bay. When she woke, Germany was visible through the window, green and gray beneath an overcast sky. Her handler met her on the tarmac. A woman named Chun who spoke in clipped efficient sentences and carried a tablet loaded with briefing materials for Casey's next assignment. Before we discuss your deployment, Chun said, there's been a development. Casey tensed. Developments were rarely good news. Your request for stateside leave was approved. Chun's expression softened slightly. 3 weeks. Starting immediately. Casey stared at her. She had submitted that request months ago, before Syria, before FOB Sentinel. She had assumed it had been denied or forgotten. 3 weeks, she repeated. You have earned it. Chun handed her a folder. Travel documents, civilian identification, contact protocols. Your daughter's school lets out at 15:30. If you hurry, you can make it. For a moment, Casey could not speak. The weight of everything she had been carrying, every sacrifice and compromise and lonely night, lifted just enough for her to breathe. Thank you, she managed. She nodded once. Then she turned and walked away, already focused on the next crisis, the next operation, the next impossible situation that required someone like Casey to solve. The commercial flight to Chicago felt surreal. Casey sat in a window seat watching the clouds scroll past, trying to remember how normal people behaved in normal situations. She had been undercover for so long that authenticity felt like a performance. Her sister's house was exactly as she remembered. White siding, blue shutters, a bicycle lying on its side in the front yard. Casey stood on the sidewalk for a long moment, her heart pounding harder than it had during any firefight. Then the front door opened. Mia stood in the doorway, 12 years old and tall for her age. She had Casey's eyes and her father's stubborn chin. For a moment she just stared, uncertain. Mom? Casey crossed the distance between them in 3 strides. She wrapped her arms around her daughter and held on as if the world might try to tear them apart again. I am here, she whispered into Mia's hair. I am really here. They stood like that for a long time, mother and daughter reunited on a quiet suburban street while the afternoon sun painted everything gold. Later there would be questions, explanations that satisfied without revealing. The careful dance of a woman who lived in secrets, trying to build a bridge to a child who deserved truth. But for now, there was only this. The warmth of her daughter in her arms. The promise of 3 weeks of ordinary moments. The knowledge that somewhere across the ocean, men who had once dismissed her now carried her memory with respect. Casey closed her eyes and let herself feel something she had almost forgotten. Peace. If this story moved you, drop a comment and let us know what resonated most. Maybe you have known someone who sacrificed everything for duty while staying invisible. Or perhaps you have witnessed hidden strength finally being recognized. Share your thoughts and your favorite moment from the story.